Hi everyone, I'm Alon Lits from October Health. Very excited to have Lungile Mahluza from Deloitte Africa. She's CHRO there. And really excited to have this discussion around the world of work and how it's transitioned from a world where we had typewriters to the world of artificial intelligence. So Lungile, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on this nippy Joburg once.
So, yeah, you weren't around when there were typewriters in the working world, but you've had some phenomenal experience. So before we kick it off, do you mind just giving the audience some context around your background and experience?
Sure. So started out in technology, at least in terms of my undergrad study, and probably spent 2.5 years working in a small technology team. When I say small, literally it was two of us. At an NPO, and then went back to study before pivoting into consulting. And I think even now I still think of myself as a management consultant at heart. And the bulk of my career really has been at Deloitte. And I've had varied experiences while there. So I started out in consulting in the human capital space, largely focused on operating models across a range of industries. Then went on to work with our previous chief exec, and I think that was really great exposure just in terms of board leadership and a board exposure to the breadth of our organization. That then provided the platform for my next role, which was the Africa Strategy Unit, internal Deloitte Africa strategy. And from there on to the current role as Chief People Officer for Deloitte Africa.
Awesome. So I think your experience is quite unique as a Chief People Officer. Often people kind of work their way up within the HR organization, but I think you're uniquely placed given your experience building out that strategy unit as Chief of Staff, etc. How do you think that set you up for success in your current role?
So I think certainly the experience that I've had and the breadth of experience that I've had has given me, I suppose, maybe a particular approach to how I think about this role and how I think about my responsibility. I think firstly just being conscious of the fact of needing to deliver both in terms of business outcomes but also employee experience. And I think oftentimes those things are seen as being on the opposite end of two spectrums, and they're not. I think there's an inherent tension, yes, but delivering to both outcomes. And then I think also just taking, I suppose, a more integrative approach with an appreciation for the intersect between strategy, people, and technology. And then I think thirdly, just the way in which I suppose my own journey has unfolded at Deloitte and the ability to learn and grow and do different things. I think of my role as being about building a platform for the professionals in the firm to have, the opportunity to also learn, grow, and navigate their career journeys in different ways. So I'd probably say, those are the things that stand out when I think about how my experience has shaped how I approach the role and how I think about what my current job is.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure you bring, given your experience, a lot of credibility when it comes to making business cases to business leaders, but also just talking about varied career paths and the opportunities a firm like Deloitte provides you with.
I should hope so. I might hope so.
No, I think it's super unique and very valuable to the organization. In terms of kind of starting to talk about our topic and shifts in the working world, I know you weren't there when there were typewriters, but you've done your time and you've seen the world evolve day to day and, some really massive shifts in the way we work in the world of work. So what are some of those bigger shifts that you've witnessed?
Yeah, I mean, you make me sound so old now. I mean, I certainly wasn't around when they were typewriters.
Definitely, no.
But, I suppose, so if I think about maybe the ones that are most interesting to my mind, I think what we've seen is an acceleration. So I don't think that the shifts are necessarily new, but I think we've seen an evolution and an acceleration. And I suppose perhaps what makes the topic interesting is how different shifts are interacting right, with one another. So of course, I think the shift just in business models, and particularly I speak here with the lens of professional services, the sorts of things that clients are demanding, how clients are articulating value, the value that they're looking for from a service provider, like a professional services firm, I think has definitely shifted. Technology, of course we can't, talk about shifts without talking about tech, but I think the thing that's interesting for me is the way in which technology is forming and shaping us, more than just the tech itself. And then certainly the evolution of work models. So whether we're talking gig, hybrid, remote work, is another big shift. And then I guess, also, the cultural and social norms around work and the role of work in our lives and the expectations that people have of work. And I think certainly another shift to my mind is this idea of recognizing that we are whole human beings. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot more emphasis on well-being more broadly, a lot more emphasis on mental health coming into the conversation in organizations. So, I'm fairly certain there are a bunch of other shifts that I've not mentioned. But I think for me, the interesting thing is the way in which these shifts are all, I suppose, interacting and providing, I think, what is a pretty systemic shift right now in the way in which we approach work and think about work more broadly.
So there's no shortage of change, and I think the reality is that change is only going to accelerate. And given that speed of acceleration, and to your point around thinking about employees as holistic, human beings, how do you equip your team members with the skills that they need to adapt to that change?
Yeah, so sure. Look, I definitely don't want to make it sound as if like we, have the formula on pat here. I think a lot of what is important is just adaptability and a lot of experimentation with approaches and what may or may not work in the context of an organization as diverse and talent pools as diverse as what we have within the firm. So, we spoke, for instance, about tech just now, and early on we were reflecting on all the evolution we're seeing from an AI perspective. So just even equipping certainly my own team with those skills, and how do you approach the topic of managing people, talent, HR with that lens. That's been one of the most important things of the last year that we've sought to do. So they've all been going through, a program to upskill as one practical example.
Awesome. And I think that really talks to a growth mindset, which, is, I think, critical to, stay relevant in today's world. Kind of going back to your experience, you've kind of dealt with a lot of industries, going back to this question and your view on the shifts that we've seen in the world of work. Have you noticed differences or similarities given that you've worked across healthcare, fintech, retail, consulting? Is it very different, or are there common themes across these various industries?
So I think one of the things with industries and sectors specifically is there's actually a lot of convergence. And by that, I mean, you're seeing areas of adjacent growth that you perhaps hadn't seen in the past. So, for instance, retail organizations also becoming financial services institutions, and even healthcare organizations also, playing in that space. So I think because of the convergence, because of the impact of technology, because of the ways in which people are approaching work, I think there's a lot more commonality than differences. And because of that convergence, I think, you see a lot more common themes, I think, than areas of differentiation across sectors and various industries.
Yeah, that's a super, great point. I think as much as everyone has a different focus, what they do and how they do it is becoming more similar as technology advances, which is unexpected. If we look at Deloitte, I think obviously it's a broad organization, right? You've got a lot of different units, different employee personas doing different things. Touching on that point that we spoke to around that growth mindset, but now applying it more broadly to your people strategy at Deloitte. How do you ensure that the organization can adapt to this world that's, advancing so quickly from a technological perspective?
Yeah, so maybe, I suppose you can take a philosophical approach, right? And go, what's the philosophical positioning around strategy? But perhaps to talk about some of the practical things that, we're doing. So one is just putting the tools in people's hands. So, for instance, we've rolled out a virtual AI assistant that's available to everyone in the organization. And this is to allow, I suppose, rather than being definitive around specific use cases, just allowing people to experiment and learn. And as they do that, you then, figure out what are the most useful use cases and just getting people used to using these tools. I do think that there's some organizations perhaps that take the view that, they will not deploy AI tools broadly in their organizations. But I think the realization that we had is, well, probably, more than half our people probably had a ChatGPT accounts anyway, right? So might as well make those tools available.
And on your terms, right, that you can kind of have a control over data usage, etc.
Precisely. I think just another practical thing in terms of just playing to understanding a multi-generational workforce that we have done is institute what we call the Next Gen Council. So this is 12 to 14 young professionals from across, the Africa member firms. So we're in 12 English-speaking countries. And they actually act as an advisory board to our executive. So they will work on specific strategic topics. So the 1 year, for instance, it was, how do we really establish a culture of innovation? The other topic that they worked on is how do we bring purpose to life in the work that we do? So various topics that are linked to our strategy that they then advise the executive on, and then we, figure out within the different portfolios how we take those recommendations forward. But then they also act as reverse mentors and to us as an exec, So our workforce right now is predominantly millennial and Gen Z, whereas, most of the leaders are either millennial, Gen X, or a little older. We won't be ageist. And, so to my mind, those are just some of the practical things. And then I think just also a focus on stuff like mental health and well-being more broadly in addressing both the expectations that the people in our organization have, as well as supporting and responding to some of the shifts that we're seeing from a tech perspective.
I love that advisory board. I think it's so powerful, and I wish it was something our governments would maybe like to implement. But you've touched on mental health and well-being. Earlier you spoke about, this tension between, performance and caring about people. How do you ensure that those things coexist? I mean, Deloitte is, a top employer globally. You're a top brand globally. You attract top talent. So clearly you're getting performance right. And people are like, how do you ensure that people, enjoy work, right? And do so and perform at the highest level in a sustainable fashion?
Yeah. So, I think you touch on, so there's performance, there's, I guess, well-being more broadly. And I suppose this idea of purpose somewhere in there. And to my mind, it has to start with just some basic fundamentals, right? So meaningful work and the ability to have autonomy in the work that people do. Hands-on leadership, like providing the structure and the support that people need. And then a workplace that is an enjoyable environment, for people, as well as, the opportunities for growth and leadership that people feel that they can trust. And to my mind, I think those are the foundations and the fundamentals, right? Even before you sort of tack on well-being and purpose and so on. And I think maybe just this point around both well-being and purpose, to my mind, there is perhaps this thing around purpose being defined as something that is purely altruistic when we think about organizations. And I don't personally think that is, for me anyway, a definition that resonates. I had this interesting conversation with a colleague just yesterday, actually, where I was asking them this very question around, how do they see purpose coming to life in the work that they do, with this idea of like meaningful work, right? And how that links to well-being. And they said to me, well, they think about, so they gave me a practical example of how they'd worked with a particular client. And this is, a large client who had gone through multiple, I suppose, restructuring and, multiple waves of retrenchments. And they spoke about how they had applied their skills, which is, quite a technical skill that they have to support an operation efficiency program, which then meant that that client could make the decision not to have to retrench, right? And for them, they were linking their skill to this is a meaningful outcome. And, the client is able to achieve their business goals, but also able to retain people in employment, how that drives the economy, ECC. And I think increasingly linking purpose and meaningful work to the core skills that we have and not making it just purely an altruistic thing and is important in terms of playing to both. And then I think when it comes to mental health more broadly, and actually not just mental health, well-being more broadly, I think there's a tendency perhaps to focus on symptoms and not root cause, right? And I think you have to address both to achieve those performance outcomes that you're looking for, but also ensure the right kind of experience for professionals.
Yeah, I think there's so many practical tips there. The one point that you hit on around trust and leadership, I think, is really crucially important. And I think what we see with organizations, if wellness or well-being or kind of caring rather more broadly for employees is seen as a tick box, then it's going to be seen as a tick box and it's not going to achieve its desired outcomes because, all leadership are doing is that they're putting a well-being or EAP program in place so they know it's there versus, they're putting it there because they really care about us as employees. So, what you've described is really how do you go above that and show employees you care in an authentic way and provide them with meaning in their day-to-day so it becomes top-down and bottom-up. Some point, though, which I think is sometimes weaponized in a negative way, is this kind of friction between, people maybe taking advantage and saying, well, I'm working too hard, I'm going to burn out. And obviously in cases where that is legitimate, right, support needs to be put in place. But there are cases, maybe edge cases where people use that to get out of work that they should be doing or responsibility that they should be doing. So how do you kind of straddle that? How do you, that very fine line between ensuring that you do care, right, and you provide people with necessary support, but you also drive accountability in a way that you're accountable to your ultimate clients?
Yeah. So look, I think this is probably one of the main things that a lot of organizations are grappling with currently and finding a way through. And whilst it's important to be really sensitive to the needs of employees, the reality is we are also an organization with obligations to our clients. And those obligations we need to meet while making reasonable accommodations for individuals. I think it's also really important for organizations to be clear on what is within the control of an organization and what is not. And I think those lines have become a bit blurred in terms of just talking more holistically to well-being and mental health in particular. So whilst, yes, you provide the platform to make sure that, individuals have the support that they need, that does not come at the expense of the need to deliver to ultimate client and outcome. And there are processes, that we have in the organization for how we deal with that. So for instance, we have a risk assessment protocol for how, if you did feel that you were dealing with specifically an specific mental health or mental well-being case, what is your process for getting that individual the right help, but still holding them accountable for performance? And I mean, we've had, a couple of instances where you have an individual perhaps who's going through a performance improvement process where then mental health becomes the thing that they lead with. And so whilst it's very it can be tricky and very nuanced, I think if you have robust processes and you can actually manage both of those things and get a good outcome.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point around just bring up objectivity to something which can get heated with emotion, and then take that emotional bias out of the equation to run as fair as a process as possible.
Yeah.
I think another point, just linked to, performance, linked to ensuring that your employees deliver, is something which I think a lot of organizations get wrong, but is so easy to get right. It's just basic communication where, managers are communicating with their teams, and, team members are communicating honestly with their managers. And it sounds almost like a silly thing to say, but so often where we see things break down is where there's just a lack of communication. So your one-on-ones are just about, delivery, and you're not having honest conversations either way. How do you overcome that, or how do you get that right in an organization that's the size of Deloitte, where, you can't speak to every manager in the organization? It's not possible, but it's something which is critical to get right within an organization, because if there is strong communication both ways, a lot of these issues aren't left to the last minute because you've got that trust between leaders and team members.
Yeah, I mean, you make great points. And I think the larger an organization becomes, the more difficult that is. But I do find that in a lot of organizations, particularly this sort of the senior manager and manager layer, tends to be a very important cohort in the organizations. If you think about, these are the individuals that are, kind of between your senior execs and the teams that they lead. So I think co-opting those individuals, so even if it's, something that's around a specific strategic direction, and, making sure that they're engaged and that they really understand that their platforms to ask questions, using, even tools and tech to listen, right, in the organization to pick up sentiment, and addressing that sentiment very, very quickly. But I think really important to make sure that those individuals or those cohorts in an organization are empowered and can ask questions, and can also be part of, I suppose, shaping and co-creating some of the, sort of really key initiatives. I think what senior leaders perhaps don't do enough of is asking sharper questions and listening. So often it is around, telling rather than actually inviting that feedback, and actually asking employees, how would you approach this? Like, what do you see on the ground that I might not be cognizant of as a leader, because I'm 10 steps removed from sort of the day to day. And I think, this devolving and empowerment to sort of where the rubber hits the road in terms of key decisions, and empowering staff to act on things without needing, to seek permission up the line, of course, within certain guardrails, I think becomes an important way of building that trust, but also making sure that you kind of have this two-way flow of engagement, and not just a one-directional communication and telling.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think often people are making decisions based on their own context, and they're missing the full picture, right? So by having those conversations, you're just increasing the context that you have around the organization, and those decisions that you can make are therefore more powerful. So I think that's a really valuable point. I also love the point around, and it's a consistent theme in what you're sharing around ensuring that, I guess, people can drive value to the organization, right, in a way that's meaningful, maybe beyond their day-to-day, but also that alignment across the organization to the broader mission is definitely something that is consistent. Maybe changing tact slightly. We were having a conversation earlier, and I think the reality is no one knows, but I can't not ask you, given your experience in tech, your experience in strategy, your experience running, leading the people function in, one of the largest organizations on the continent, is how do you think AI is going to impact the jobs we do today, and what jobs are we going to be doing in the future?
Well, that's an easy answer. I don't know. Look, my sense is that this is a topic that's evolving, and a topic that's evolving fairly rapidly. And so I think there are a couple of things perhaps that are important in terms of thinking about jobs, or thinking about, how you prepare for organizations. I mean, one of the things that we are definitely seeing coming to the fore is, this whole area around agentic AI, where increasingly, you see AI agents, right, working, I would say, alongside professionals and really taking on some of the tasks that maybe are repetitive. And what's interesting for me, if I think about, professional services organizations or organizations that have what I would think of as an apprentice model, right? So where you hire largely, large numbers of young professionals who come into an organization and work their way through. And, typically they start out with, doing some of those more, I suppose, like repetitive things as they're learning. And I'm seeing that we will start to see increasingly that that work will be done by AI agents. I think that then changes the shape of organizations. And then I think it changes the level of work and the complexity and the kinds of skills that you then are bringing in at junior levels in an organization relative to, I suppose, what you might be hiring now and how you might think about the ways in which people develop and progress in their careers. So to my mind, that's definitely like one of the key things that I think is we're currently seeing, and even in the work that we're doing with clients, is one of the ways I think that we're seeing AI comes to the fore. And then I think it's just important to experiment and remain adaptable and be able to respond quickly as we see developments unfold.
I think that adaptability, the only guarantee, to your point, is uncertainty, right, or change. So adaptability is key. Maybe again on this theme of kind of the changing architecture, if I can use that word, of the workforce, what skills do you think people should be thinking about, no matter where they are career-wise? Because I think you're right that, maybe those more entry-level jobs, right, where they're repetitive tasks, the reality of their day-to-day is going to change dramatically, but there's going to be an impact across the spectrum, regardless of the seniority of your role. What skills do you think people should be thinking about?
So, I think to my mind, I think it's hard to be definitive on a specific skill. I think what is maybe a helpful way of thinking is this idea of enduring human capabilities, right? And specifically there, that becomes a way of thinking rather than anything that is a specific skill, and a way of thinking that you can build skills on, right? So to my mind, it's things like problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, adaptability that we've already spoken about. So I actually think that the emphasis needs to be on how do we build those human capabilities, because that then supports how you continue to learn, grow, remaining curious, building new skills and adapting to the world as it evolves. So certainly the way I think about it is less about what is the specific skill, but what is the capability that we need, and then how do you build skills on top of that? Is the way in which I would think about it.
That makes a ton of sense, and it's about getting that foundation right and building upon that as we adapt to all these, I guess, the new world.
Yeah, I think remaining curious and open to learning and growing at whatever stage of your career, really, I think is critically important.
Yeah. And I think that growth mindset is, again, something which has come through clearly from you. So thank you. Just if we think about pipeline of tomorrow and diversity and inclusion, how do we kind of, similar to wellness programs where there sometimes, not always, but sometimes a tick box within the organization, diversity is done as a tick box exercise, and what organizations don't get right is real inclusion. How do you think about both, hiring from a diversity perspective and ensuring that organizations can create an environment that is truly inclusive?
So I think, diversity, I suppose, and how we define diversity is going to continue to evolve. Obviously they're the categories that, we currently would all be aware of. And I think increasingly we're seeing things like even cognitive diversity coming to the fore. And if you think about how you would recruit, let's say, a neurodiverse individual versus, someone, perhaps who isn't on that spectrum, your interviewing methods, right? And the medium that you use. And, on the topic of AI, I mean, we're seeing, even AI starting to play an increasingly important role there. So on the one hand, I am a firm believer that it's important to have hard metrics like, firm targets and so on. It then becomes about the substantive experience that people have in an organization, and whether in terms of your policies and your practices, you are actually adapting those. So beyond the numbers game, right? To say, oh, we have so many neurodiverse people, we have so many, blue, green, brown, whatever color people, or different ages, and all of those elements. I think the policies that organizations drive. So practical example, if we talk about, something that's topical, women in the workplace, and specifically citing the Women at Work reports that we produce on an annual basis. I mean, some of the things that are spoken about there that make the environment inclusive from a policy perspective is the ability to actually be able to address bias and things like microaggressions. So having processes for those things to be reported and dealt with, having programs or policies around, how do you reintegrate women, for instance, who have had children back into the workplace. So whilst this is maybe just one narrow example or one narrow area from a diversity and inclusion perspective, it must translate beyond targets and numbers to actual policies, processes in the organization. On the topic of parenting, for instance, and, across both men and women, setting up meetings at 7:30 or 7 in the morning, for instance, when, whether it is a dad or a mom or an aunt or, whatever, might be doing a school drop off. It's the small and big things in the way in which the practices and the policies of organization are brought to life, I think, that drive real inclusion beyond just a numbers game.
Yeah, so I think, what's critical in an organization the size of Deloitte is that you've got to have those policies in place, because without that, I guess there's too much room for human error to creep in. Plus, it goes back to an earlier point that you made just around that trust, right, between leaders and the communication. Because, if you actually, understand your team members and know that, that person is a parent, to your point, you probably won't do that, right? But if you don't even know that, and as frightening as it is, people may not have those conversations or understand the nuance of an individual's day to day, you're just not going to account for that. And then as a result, something which could be innocent, right, setting up an early morning meeting, can have that very negative consequence. So I think, just being, again, taking from what you've shared, having that more context around your workplace is just such a critical element, which often is just, something which we don't get right. Maybe as we kind of draw to the end and building on this point, what are you doing to, empower managers to ensure that they can adapt to this changing workforce, that, the dynamic of, different generations in the workforce? I know we've touched on a continuous mindset, but how do you ensure that, they are delivering at the level that you expect them to?
So one of the things that I think has been important in the approach is this idea of, and you mentioned it earlier on, thinking through the personas that you have in an organization, and thinking about what is a compelling proposition for different personas. So I'll make a practical example. We were joking earlier on that I've been at Deloitte long enough to have a teenage child who I could have named Deloitte. So I would maybe consider myself the Deloitte lifer persona, whereas someone else might be let's call them an entrepreneur in residence, right? And they are not interested in a long-term career with an organization. They're there for 4 to 5 years to really, get the most that they can, probably while growing a business on the side. Now, approaching, I think, sort of the talent pool in that way, and supporting just even managers and understanding what are the personas that you have within your own team, And how do you, I suppose, manage, right, those different personas to get, an outcome? So that's, in terms of things like, how do you incentivize? How do you performance manage? How do you reward? How do you even pace the types of opportunities, right, that an individual would have? So you can imagine the entrepreneur in residence is there for a very short period of time. Probably the pace of their career is going to be very different to someone who is maybe taking a longer term view. And I think just that ability to be a lot more targeted in terms of the actual, let's call them the people practices that you have from a talent perspective is, to my mind, one of the ways in which we're trying to get that right. And I say trying because, it evolves and it's an experimental. One of the things we experimented with, for instance, with, let's call them the entrepreneur in residence persona, is something we call Deloitte gigs. And that was literally like going, okay, we know you all have side hustles. Why don't you formalize, of course, within certain guardrails and parameters, formalize the side hustle and utilize the brain power of the firm to help you grow that side hustle. So that as a proposition for the entrepreneur would be perhaps really, really compelling versus maybe someone else who's taking a different view of their career. So I think thinking through the personas and archetypes and then structuring the way in which our employee value proposition is responding to that and creating, I suppose, that awareness even with line managers and more boardroom organization is just one of the ways in which we are equipping and hopefully evolving the organization in a meaningful way.
I love that. And thanks for sharing the example. I think so powerful. And, this kind of theme of personalization, I think, is definitely something which is only going to become more critical as the workforce evolves. So as we wrap up, I know we've chatted through a lot, but if you had to leave the audience with kind of 3 things that you would use to design the perfect workplace, what would those 3 things be?
Perfect. That's an all art. So actually, this is not original thinking on my part. I think it's a model that some people might be familiar with. I think it's Daniel Pink's model. So I think just firstly, purpose. So clarity on the why. Secondly, autonomy. So this idea that I can exercise agency within the work that I do, how I approach it, how I structure it, etc. And I think mastery. So this ability to continue to grow and learn in the context of the work I do. And then the other things like, being digital natives and so on, to my mind, are enablers. But if I had to think of the 3 core things, it would certainly be clarity and purpose, designing work. So there's autonomy and the ability to gain mastery.
Awesome. And I think that's actually the perfect summary of our discussion. So Lungile, thanks so much for joining us. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience feels the same. And thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much.